thank you for joining me for this. I do want to say that this is going to be a bit of a 10,000 foot flyby. I'm going to speak with you for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A that you can begin to offer. And I would suggest that even as your questions come to you, feel free to offer those in the chat room. Ashley's going to keep track of those, and we'll offer those out at the end of our time. The title of my talk is Jesus Isn't Worried About Your Kids, Parenting in an Age of Anxiety. And I start with that to say Jesus isn't worried about your kids. And then I want to say, and I don't know why he's not. I mean, I think he should be, in fact. And in fact, I mean, I've got 2 adult kids, and I have the sense that when the new heaven and earth get here, he and I are going to have some conversations about why he wasn't more actively engaged around the anxiety that I have about my children. Certainly, we are anxious about our children. Certainly, we see anxiety in our lives, in the lives of our children. But I do want to impress upon us to first really pay attention to and imagine, what does it really mean? What is it like for us to contend with this notion that Jesus is not anxious? He's not worried about our children, because he is too busy doing his Father's work within us, within our own children, between us and our children, between us and our neighbors. And as such, worry isn't part of the equation for him. Keeping that imagined notion in mind, I want to then just begin. We're going to walk through some of these ideas that I have to share with us this morning. And in particular, we're going to get at the very end, we'll have some particulars to address as far as COVID itself is concerned. So as I do this, I want to provide 2 pieces of information that are resources for you. And I can't really highly emphasize these enough. So you're going to get, 40 minutes from me, but these 2 resources are things that you can go to and get a ton of information. They'll be highlighted. Ashley's going to highlight these in the chat that you can see these 2 links. One is a link to a place called the Child Mind Institute. And the particular page that you're going to land on is their page on anxiety. And there is a trove of information there that's very practical, very helpful, and quite comprehensive about how do we understand anxiety, how do we approach this with our children, and how do we approach this with ourselves as well. So that's number 1, the Child Mind Institute and the landing page on anxiety. And the second link is to an article written in the journal The Atlantic. And I really want to encourage you to read this, because this is an article that invites us to consider, what does it mean for us as parents to become who we are becoming over the course of these last several years? And how does that then lead to what we witness in our children? So those are 2, I think, really helpful resources for us I want to point you to begin with this. Next, I just want to start with exploring the question, when we say anxiety, what is it? What is it what we're talking about? It's a word, it's a catch-all word. First of all, it's an ancient word. The ancients knew about it. Jesus spoke about it. The Old Testament talks about it. And it takes on lots of different forms for us. But I want to give us 4 or 5 different fundamental elements that we think about when we think about this thing called anxiety. The first thing that we need to know is that anxiety, before anything else, is an embodied event. It's something that we feel in our bodies. And it's how the brain works. The brain operates bottom to top and right to left, we like to say. And we feel anxious in our bodies before we know that we are anxious with our thinking brains. So the first thing to know is that it's an embodied experience. And this is important because when we witness anxiety, or what we believe to be anxiety in our children, we often tend to think that all we need to do is tell them to not be anxious, as if that's going to help them not be anxious. But we have to be aware that we're talking to their thinking brain, don't be anxious, when it first and foremost is their embodied mind that is having the experience. This is why, as we'll relate to later, this is why sometimes they will complain about headaches or stomach aches. And what they're really talking about is anxiety, but they don't maybe perhaps have words for that yet. So the first thing that anxiety is, it's embodied. The second thing is that it's an emotional event. So it's an embodied, it's an emotional event. And emotion is a kind of a mercurial thing to try to get our hands around. It's tough to understand in its complete context. But fair to say that we all have a sense of the feeling that we have when we are anxious about things. And that feeling is something that emerges to our awareness that we can talk about. We say like, oh, I'm worried, I'm anxious about things, because first it comes in our body, but then there is this overwhelming sense of an emotional element of that. The third thing that anxiety is that it's a cognitive event. I start to have this experience in my body that leads to these emotional states that then I start to think about. And my cognition is important because I have thoughts about my anxiety, but I also have thoughts about what my anxiety is leading me to think about. So I think about the future. I think about the test I'm going to take, or I think, am I going to be okay in COVID? I have all these kinds of thoughts that, unlike dogs, as far as we know, unless you're in a Gary Larson comic strip, unlike dogs, we actually have thoughts about our anxiety that can reinforce the anxiety. And so we go from the body to emotion to cognition, which can circle back around and actually reinforce the embodied emotional elements of this. And cognition, we can have various different thoughts about the future in some way, shape, or form. But at some point, all of this, my embodied emotional cognitive experience of anxiety, becomes a narrative experience. I begin to tell myself a story. I'm not going to be okay if I go to school. I'm not going to be okay if I leave the house. Is mom going to be here when I get back? All these kinds of worries that we can have. And we as adults, like, we already get this because we've been practicing being anxious for a long time. We know that anxiety takes all of these embodied cognitive and emotional elements and we turn them into a story. And the story itself can become so big that when we then say, I'm anxious, I'm not just referring to anxiety as some kind of homogeneous thing that I experience. I'm talking about an entire narrative that I have woven. And if I'm a child, I've been at it for maybe a few years, but as an adult, I've been at it for many, many years, maybe even several decades. As followers of Jesus, we would say that anxiety, beyond being that embodied emotional cognitive event, we would say it also has a certain existential element to it. We would say that at the end of the day, anxiety is ultimately not just about, will I be able to perform well on the test? But we take that further, because if I don't perform well at the test, then I might fail the class and then drop out of school, and I will end up living in a box under a bridge, even though I'm only in third grade. These kinds of fears are really linked to this notion that anxiety tells me that I'm worried that I'm going to be left alone. Existentially, it's about this sense of abandonment. Anxiety is primarily not just about, will I do this well enough? Will I be okay? It is, will I be okay, and will you be with me? Or will I be left alone in my not being okay? We don't have time to address all this right now, but I think it's fair to say that it's different. Anxiety is different than fear. There are certain fears, and this neurophysiologically, these can be measured, and they track differently in the brain. They're different, but in terms of how our bodies, different in terms of how our bodies and minds react, but they're related. I won't get into all that right now, but it's important for us to be able to differentiate the language that we use. Am I afraid? I'm not afraid in the same way that if I'm attacked by a rabid dog, that's not anxiety necessarily, but I could then be anxious about walking down the street, fearful that I might be approached by a dog. Those are different, but it's important for us to be able to explore those things differently with our children. These things are also expressed differently. Anxiety is expressed differently. All this emotional and cognitive and embodied expression comes differently for different people. And these things are different depending upon 4 different things that we can talk about today. The first is just a child's temperament. A child's temperament. Every baby comes into the world with a different genetically based temperament. And so different children are going to have different responses to similar circumstances. And whether those circumstances are coming to them from outside their skin or from inside their own mind. So temperament is one. Number 2, the general environment that they grow up in. This has to do with our family environments that we're all familiar with. This has to do with our attachment patterns that many of you are now also familiar with as you're working with children in many different realms. We know that attachment plays a huge role in the way that children regulate their affect, not least of which how they respond to anxiety. But I want to say that there's a particular element that I'm going to highlight. We're going to come back to this later in our talk. And that has to do with the element of time. And one of the things that we find in our culture, and has been the case probably for at least the last 30 to 40 years, is that time has been shrinking. And what do I mean by that? We like to say that technology does at least two things. It, number one, makes life more convenient. And number two, it potentially sets up the possibility for us to be less connected, despite the fact that it makes life more convenient. But every time we develop technology that makes life more convenient, it gives us more time to do more things. And now we're actually doing more things in a shorter period of time, which is why many children feel the rush and the urgency because parents have to get to this and to this and to this and to this. And that time shrinkage makes everything feel more urgent. So one of the first things I would suggest for us to examine is, what's the structure of our family life together? What's the pace with which we are living? How many things are we trying to fit in? How many tasks are we trying to multiply do in any one given time? Time is just one example of the ways in which the structure of our family environment is probably one of the largest ways in which we set children up to either be more or less anxious in and around and in response to everyday common things. So we have temperament, we have our general environment, we have particular experiences. Different children have particular experiences. If you had an event of being bullied on the playground, being in and around people that feel like they're more aggressive can make one more anxious. That might not be the same experience that one of your other children has had. So we can have particular experiences. And then we have what we call unresolved trauma. And by this, many of you are familiar with trauma-informed care of children. And that unresolved trauma, one of the things that it does is that it takes up residence in our bodies. And it becomes an access point for things that tend to make us anxious in the first place. And so those things that heretofore might not have made me anxious if I don't have that unresolved trauma, now it does. And so those are just four things: temperament, general environment, particular experiences of each individual in the world, and then unresolved trauma, four things that kind of set us up for anxiety. But here's something else that's really important for us to hear. And if there's nothing else that you remember from our time today, I want you to remember this. The feeling of anxiety is normal. The feeling of anxiety is part of what it means to be human. It is not a pathology. It is not a problem. It is part of what enables us to actually live and flourish in the world, not just survive, but to flourish in the world. Anxiety, therefore, is normal. Anxiety disorders, they are not normal, and those are things that in psychiatry we talk an awful lot about, because that's where anxiety, which is normal, actually ends up going in a direction that makes it more difficult for people to function. Our challenge in our culture is that we have taken what is a normal human experience, anxiety, and we have made it to be something that is worse than it should be. If we think about anxiety on a bell curve, for instance, we know that if we have too little anxiety, we just sit around and watch the paint dry. If we have too much anxiety, we become overwhelmed by circumstances. And so as parents, we need to know that we need a certain level of anxiety to survive and to flourish. We want to help children use anxiety to develop resilience. We don't want to eliminate anxiety. To eliminate anxiety sends the message that we believe you as a child are way too fragile to live in the real world. We don't want to create children of fragility. We don't want them to be afraid of anxiety. We want them to be a resilient people. So one of the next things that's important to ask, given that anxiety is normal, and we are looking for ways at times somewhat non-consciously, we're unaware, looking to ways to rid our world of anxiety, one of the first important things that we can ask is, whose anxiety is it to begin with? When we say, oh, my child is anxious, how do I know? We've already talked about how anxiety tends to show up in embodied, emotional, cognitive forms. But one of the first questions that we have to ask is that when we witness our child's anxiety, or what we perceive our child's anxiety to be, what do we do? As parents, if we think that we witness our children being anxious, what does that evoke in us? Am I anxious? You betcha I am. And then the question becomes, what do I do with my anxiety in response to my children's anxiety? Because a lot of what we can end up doing as parents is, I want my child to stop being anxious so that I can stop being anxious. Could you please not be anxious so that I will feel better? I don't say these things to my children, but sometimes this is how we end up parenting. It's important to know this then. Your child, our children, can become anxious on their own, but they regulate their anxiety by watching us. They can be, let me say that again, they become anxious on their own, but they learn to regulate their anxiety by watching us, by watching what we do. And again, our job is not to try to eliminate anxiety. Our job, that'd be like trying to eliminate skinned knees from kids. Just don't run ever in your life, and you won't skin your knee. We're not trying to eliminate skinned knees. We're not trying to eliminate anxiety. We're trying to help them learn how to live with it and to flourish even in the face of it. So here's one of these questions, right? How do you regulate your anxiety? How do you first identify your anxiety? How do you know when you are anxious? Where do you sense it in your physicality? How did you learn when you were growing up in your home, in your attachment patterns? What did you learn to do with what we tend to call anxiety? Did I just bury that when I was growing up in my house? I grew up in a house where whenever I was upset about something, my father, maybe some of you can relate to this, my father had a favorite phrase: I want you to stop your crying or I'm going to give you something to cry about. Now, besides the logical inconsistency with that, which I, as an 8-year-old, didn't really feel like I could argue that with my dad, there's something to be said about, well, what have we learned to do with our anxiety? And how do I process that? This then gets back just to this notion of time. Not just how do I feel on a large scale, but what do I do on a large system scale? What are we doing as parents to create systems in our home in which we are not creating an environment that actually heightens anxiety, but rather gives us the space to regulate it by actually being curious about it? It's hard for us to be curious about our children's anxiety if we are still having to rush to get them out the door to school. Some of us are familiar with how we can become helicopter parents. Some of you are also familiar now with the most recent form of this, which is what we call lawnmower parents, helicopter parents, those who are hovering over their children, lawnmower parents who are out in front of their children, out calling their college advisors, asking them if the parents can have a conversation for their child who's 18 or 19 or 20 years of age. Those are extremes, but we all know that we can have ways in which we behave kind of like that. Here's just some examples of these. You'll read this in one of the in the article and in the Atlantic. There are just some examples of some parents and how they were trying to respond to their children's distress. Their child is too afraid to go upstairs to get their backpack that they left upstairs before going up to school. So the parent, in order to not make their kid be distressed, is willing to walk upstairs and get the child's backpack. A parent who is checking the child's homework for 30 minutes every day to make sure that the child is going to be okay with their homework. Driving the child to school because they're too afraid to get onto a bus, and so we don't ever make them get on the bus. Remaining, this is a tricky one, right? Because sleep is like a big issue for children. Remaining with a child until they fall asleep while they're up into their second, third grade, because the parent is too anxious about what will happen if the child is too anxious falling asleep. These are just some of those of the examples. I'm sure that you could all name some. You might be experiencing them. And here's the thing, I get it. This is not a matter of we're all just really bad parents at this. It still gets back to this question of, what are we doing about our own anxiety, and how able are we to name how I worry about what is the worst case scenario? What's the catastrophic end point if my child suffers with this? What am I afraid is going to happen to me? What am I going to feel if I have to encounter my child being anxious in a way that makes it difficult for me to know what to do? Our response to anxiety, again, is not to make it go away. but to teach our children to tolerate it, work through it, and develop resilience. In this way, we like to say that as far as our children are concerned, we're not attempting to help them develop certainty. We want them to develop confidence. We would like for the world to be certain. We'd like to be absolutely certain in the world. But we don't ever develop certainty about anything. I can't be certain that I'll be alive 10 minutes from now. I mean, I hope I am, because that would be kind of a bummer for you all watching this. But you know what I mean. We can't know things for certain, but we want to develop confidence. But confidence comes through two particular elements. Confidence is developed through connection, number one, and competence, number two. Connection meaning that my child is going to be aware that while they go through this hard thing that their anxiety is telling them about, that I am going to be present with them in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to help them work through this anxiety that belongs to them. And as they do so, they develop competence. They learn that they can actually get on the bus. They learn that we'll wait and you can go get your backpack, and when you come back down, we'll go to school. Connection and competence. It is a gift to help children work through their anxiety, not a gift to help them avoid it. It's a gift to help them work through it, not to avoid it. So then we get really down to then, like, what do we do about anxiety? What are some concrete ways? Again, I want to refer you especially to the link to the Child Mind Institute. There are a ton of really helpful concrete resources there about how to actually do things in certain situations with our children when our children are feeling anxious. But again, one of the first things that's important for us to recognize is that when my child gets anxious, I need to recognize that anxiety is really what we're dealing with. But anxiety is, again, it's a signal to us. It's a signal about something that my child might be worried about or is upset about. And so recognizing it is half the battle. For many of us who have young children who are anxious, our young children are having some challenges because they haven't yet learned that anxiety is what they're experiencing. And so helping them recognizing it by giving them language is important for them to be able to have words to say, oh, I think I'm anxious, or I think I'm afraid of something, or I think I'm having a worry about a particular thing. Remember again that this anxiety can show up not just as anxiety, but because it comes to us primarily in the body, it can show up first as being headaches or stomach aches. And so when our children demonstrate those kinds of physical ailments, it's a question to be curious about. Oh, I wonder if they're anxious about something, if their body is telling them that they're uncomfortable with something that's going on. And so one of the first things that's important for us to do as parents is to develop the disciplined practice of curiosity. I cannot overstate this too much. Again, my daughter is 30 and my son is 27. And, there are still times when they are doing things and making decisions, and I want to be in charge of their life. I want to be in charge of the decisions that they're making about the things that they're doing, how they're doing them. And when I hear them say that they've decided to do this or to do that, I immediately, I get anxious. Or there are times, perhaps, for instance, when they're not doing something and I'm anxious and I want to know, why aren't you more anxious? Why aren't you taking action on this? And I want to tell them what to do. And instead of being curious, I want to act. I want to speak for them on their behalf to themselves about what they should be doing. Developing curiosity means that we develop a posture in which we really do want to ask questions. So tell me, what's that like for you? Tell me how you're doing with this. Our son is about to move across the country to start graduate school, and he had to get housing, which, thanks be to God, has worked out. But as he was doing this, he was doing it on a timeline that I thought could have been started at a different time. Not that anybody here would ever have, think that your children should be doing things at a different timeline than you would. But it would be easy for me to say, why aren't you taking action? Instead, I have to practice being curious and say, so tell me what your plans are. And the very act of being curious, even with our young children, the very act of being curious and not telling them what to do, not acting out of our own anxiety, actually is the very first step that creates space for them to breathe deeply and to be less anxious. When we demonstrate curiosity rather than anxiety ourselves in the face of our children's distress, we help them be more at ease, first of all, in their bodies. When we notice what might be anxiety in our children, whether that's in their facial expression or tone of voice, or even in the way they're sitting, we want to help them locate that in their body. So in this way, we're being collaborative in our curiosity. We want to be curious with them about, do you sense that or feel that someplace in your body? Where do you feel that? Not try to correct them for this. This is where we can give them words. How often do we hear someone say, we notice that our kids are anxious, they express that perhaps in some way, and we say, oh, you'll be fine. You're fine. You don't really know that you're fine. They're actually not fine, and they know that they're not fine. And so how is it that they then are being told that they're fine when they know that they're not? That only tends to make them more anxious. So one of the next things that we want to do is we want to validate their anxiety. We want to validate that they're sensing, feeling something. They need to be listened to in this regard and approached with empathy. They don't become anxious on purpose. Let me just say this again. Children do not wake up in the morning and say, gosh, I hope I'm more anxious by the end of the day. That would really piss off my dad. Kids are not doing these kinds of things. They're not doing this on purpose. And so when they had this experience, it is important for us to empathically validate that. But that's different than vindicating it. And what's the difference? We're validating anxiety. We're not vindicating it. What do I mean by that? My child can be anxious about a certain thing, and their experience of anxiety is real. It's not pretend. And it's important to be able to say, oh, that must not feel very good. I see how you're feeling. That is not to equate their perception of what that means to be the same thing. That is not to say, oh, you're right, you can't get on the bus. To be anxious and to be validated for being anxious is not to be vindicated for what I have now made that out to mean. As a child, we're validating them, we're not vindicating them. We want to say to them, essentially, this is hard, but I'm with you in this, so let's try this. Not just simply, you'll be fine. There's nothing wrong with you. Validation, but not vindication. Next, we want to help them work through. We want working through their anxiety. So there are several steps in helping them work through this. We first of all want to invite them to talk about it. We want to invite them to talk about, what's this like for you? Help us understand what this is like. We need to have a safe space for them to talk. They need to have a safe space to talk about this. But then I would ask you this question, us as parents, we ask this question. Do we feel like we have safe spaces for naming what makes us anxious? You know, in my marriage, I have this thing that I do. If I get anxious about something that I feel like I should be competent to do, but I'm not. Let's say fix a toilet. Let's say anything that's out there that I don't necessarily have the exact skill set for. Let's say it's go to a party where you're going to spend 3 hours talking about all kinds of things that to me don't really mean very much, but somehow we have to pull this off. I might be anxious, but instead of naming that I'm anxious about something, I bury that, I swallow that, and then I get passive because I can't figure out what to do about this. Sometimes we as adults don't believe that we have safe spaces. Now, after 34 years of marriage, my wife has done everything possible to create space for us to have safety for conversations about these things. But if I don't have the sense that I can safely name what makes me anxious, because I'm working so hard not to let anybody else be anxious, lest they see me be anxious and then become anxious, if I don't sense that I have safe space, it's be very difficult for me to create that space for my child. But creating a safe space to talk, again, curiosity is an important element of this. As we said earlier, the next thing that we want to do is we want to give them words. They often don't have words for this. If you're talking about really small children, you might say, oh, you might have some like flutter in your tummy. Oh, your head hurts. Oh my goodness, your head hurts. Tell me about, where does it hurt? How is that? What is that like for you? And especially as we think about older children, teenagers, we also want to acknowledge, again, that like it might be hard to talk about some of these things, but our curiosity continues to inform them that with curiosity, we're giving them language. One of the things that we know that happens often with, especially with preteens and teens, is that their brains, as many of us are aware, their brains begin to somewhat reconfigure. Anybody who works with teenagers, who lives with teenagers, we've all been teenagers. Anybody who does like I say reconfigure, you're like, yeah, I know what reconfiguration looks like. I thought they were human, and now they're something other than that. That reconfiguration process means that even sometimes children who easily had words for things when they were 8, 9, 10, and 11 now seem to not have words for much of anything, or they have trouble finding words because as their brains reconfigure, they find other ways to be anxious about things that they never had to be anxious about before. When you're 8 years old, your brain is not really all that interested in doing the hard work of connecting with your tribe. But when you become 13 and connecting with your particular tribe socially is now a new thing for me to be anxious about. And so I might not have words for that. So helping them find words, even in those situations where you thought you had kids who could find words before, not to be worried. Like, there's that idea again, not to be worried. These kinds of things can happen. Remembering too that anxiety is not the problem. That my child is anxious is normal. It's not the problem. So what do we want to do? We want to name the problem and provide options. You're afraid to go to school? What do you think will happen? One of the most important things that we can help children do is to have a conversation in which we actively ask them to walk down the path of what they're worried about and help them discover, well, what's the next thing that would happen? And the next thing that happened? What's the worst thing that could happen? And everywhere along the way, we are curious with them, well, what do you think you could do then? What would you like me to do? What about your teacher? What do you think she might do? So much of what the brain does when it leaps out to catastrophic endpoints is that it tends to miss all the gateways that we pass through between where we are and our catastrophic endpoint, missing those opportunities for us to be able to have agency to do things that can change our posture and let us know that we can be safe. So we want to draw attention to our children's thinking, to their thoughts, and provide options for ways for them to think differently. As this emerges, one of the things that we tell parents to do is we want to help you avoid leading the witness. What do I mean by that? I want to invite you to not say, well, are you anxious? Are you feeling anxious? Anything that actually leads them to think that they might be anxious because actually you're worried that they might be anxious, those aren't ways in which we're actually trying to actively help them become more anxious. We want to be just genuinely curious in that way. Then as we give them language, we're actually helping them to make a plan for their future. We're making a plan and we're finding a solution for whatever their problem might be. Now, of course, I say this as if this is just like steps 1, 2, 3, and everybody's anxiety will be resolved. We know that this is not easy. And those sites that I gave you, those links that I gave you to go to are going to give you even a lot more information. But here's the thing. If we begin to make a plan and find a solution, we find that that's important and helpful for us as parents, because so much of what we are concerned about regarding our child's anxiety is really about ours. And so part of what we're doing as we enable a child to make a plan is that we are also in that process making that plan with them. And in making a plan, we help provide a structure. First, just by having a plan of, well, what are we going to do tomorrow when we get ready for school? What are we going to do tomorrow when we have to visit with our friends? What are we going to do when we are going to be with people that we don't know? Having a plan actually creates a neurological structure as well as creating an imagined structure. I have a plan of what I'm going to do. It's also important to know that, particularly for young children, creating a structure for them in their day and in their activities that they're going to have gives them a great deal of confidence. Remember, we're not looking for certainty, we're looking for confidence. And providing structure enables them to have greater confidence. We want to have them practicing putting their toes out into the water and then make progress. Remember, we are helping them to build resilience. Building resilience, not avoiding anxiety. One of the other things too then that I will say we haven't really touched on it yet, but I want to say, and it's about this notion of spiritual formation. I don't want us to forget that, again, remember, Jesus was familiar with the notion of anxiety. Don't be anxious for tomorrow, for today has enough anxiety of its own. Notice he didn't say, don't be anxious. Now, Paul said, don't be anxious for nothing. But Jesus said, don't be anxious for tomorrow. Today has enough of it for its own. He's not telling us we can't avoid it. But he knew what anxiety was about. And so I have a couple things to suggest to help us remember that we live in a world, that actively does things that is forming us. We as human beings are being formed, whether we know it or not. The question is always going to be, what is the primary story that is forming us? Not, am I being formed? I'm being formed. What's the story that is forming us? And as parents who are living in faith, living in what we believe to be the gospel narrative, we want to introduce our children to a world in which they can feel God's presence. They can feel God's delight. They can have experiences in which their anxiety can be shared by a God who loves them. And so just a couple of suggestions. One is, it's really helpful for us to strengthen children's resilience, strengthen children's confidence by reading them Bible stories. And one thing, for younger children in particular, I would suggest Sally Lloyd-Jones' The Storybook Bible. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. It's a really, really well done piece of literature that helps children both pictorially as well as through story talk about what they feel, because we can engage children in talking about their feelings, as we like to say, striking while the iron is cold, long before they're anxious, so that they have these stories embedded in them beforehand. For our older children, really good fiction, like the Narnia series, for instance, enables children to imagine what it's like to have a lion come to be protective of them. And the more they are imagining this, the more they actually can gain confidence in a relationship with a God who actually protects them. And then when it comes to prayer, I want to highlight and give props to a particular book that I had the chance to read and share in some of its development. A book called Imaginative Prayer by Jared Patrick Boyd. Imaginative Prayer. It is a book that I think that if you were to allow yourself to immerse yourself in with your child, you would find this to be a book that would be profoundly helpful in shaping and forming your children from their particular prayer life perspective in a way that creates a hard deck on which they can stand when they become anxious. Because remember, loving God and loving your neighbor does not prevent us from being anxious, but enables us to be able to work through our anxiety when it happens. Lastly, in the last few minutes that we have, I just want to talk a little bit about the particulars of COVID-19. We are in the middle of huge upheaval in many different ways, not least which being all the issues that are taking place with COVID. And then we have on top of this, we have economic issues, political issues, racial issues. And now for those who are living in the West, we've got forest fires on top of this. And I want to suggest that as far as the COVID-19 is concerned, that anxiety tends to become more expressed, more palpably, because of our sense of being isolated. Remember, I said that existentially, at the end of the day, anxiety is ultimately about my sense of being left, my sense of being alone. And so it's helpful for us to be having conversations with our children about their being alone, but not necessarily just placating that, being able to say, that's hard, and I'm really glad that I'm with you. Let's go read some books together. Let's connect with your friends together. Many of you might have already been bubbling together, co-laboring, I would say together. We're co-laboring through COVID together, but we have certain people that we're connecting with. And that connection makes the lack of connection that we otherwise have naturally less strenuous on the nervous system. So things that we can do to actually connect our children in ways that are helpful for them with other children. And I recognize and acknowledge that different people are in different places of comfort as far as all this is concerned. I want to acknowledge that schooling at home and the way that that shapes our work environment and what parents are now having to do is really difficult. And we as parents find ourselves becoming more anxious about a lot of things. Remember, children become anxious on their own, but they regulate their anxiety by watching you. And so here again, the question becomes, who are the people who are taking care of you, who are enabling you to be able to work through anxiety as opposed to avoiding it or being overwhelmed by it? We're also seeing instances in which now as children start back to school after they've been together with their families for 6 months, some children might have a little bit of difficulty going back. And again, we are talking about how we're seeing that anxiety just tells us that they're afraid of something in the future, but anxiety is not the problem. The problem is I might want to go to school and be afraid that will I be okay when I go to school? Again, walking out with them, walking through that, giving them concrete steps. Well, what would you do? And what would you do next? And what would you do next? All these kinds of things are things that we want to do to make it possible for our children to learn that they have agency and they can develop resilience. Then we also know that there are plenty of people for whom economics, job loss, and transitions has been really difficult. And we want to acknowledge that those things are hard. But as we acknowledge that these things are hard, we also want to remind our children, we're here with you and we have joy with you. And now let us do something creative together that teaches our child and our child's mind that even in the middle of my anxiety, I can move through it so as not to be worried. And then be reminded that at the end of the day, neither is Jesus worried about your child, even though we might think he should be. And he's not worried about us either. Our work is to be paying attention to his delight and his work both in and through and with us in order for us to then be good translators of that very love from our Savior to our children. So I'm going to stop with that and just say again, thank you so much for your kind attention. And if there are questions, I think we can go ahead and start that. Ashley might be able to facilitate that. And I know we have a few minutes left that we can do that. So
we do. Thank you, Dr. Curt. My own notebook was filled with all these notes and everyone's asking if they can watch again. And this was recorded. It'll be online. I will put that link in the chat, but go ahead and send your questions in. We have a few minutes here. Dr. Curt, one of the questions that came in was, could you just speak a little bit about the difference between stress and anxiety? Because we might even say we're experiencing a lot of stress and maybe if there's a difference there. Or...
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things that we talk about stress as if it is an independent thing that happens to us. Well, that situation is stressful. And we all know what we mean when we say that, but it is important to recognize that stress is a thing that we create. Stress is a thing that we create. Now, it's easy for us to create it. I don't mean that you're just not being disciplined enough. If you're making yourself be stressful, gosh, there's a pandemic, I shouldn't be stressed, I'm making this up. No, I'm not saying that that we're somehow ill-disciplined if we're making things up. My point is that stress is that which we imagine, which we experience, and it is anxiety is part of that. Stress is that which we experience when we perceive things to be a certain thing, so I have a pandemic, I'm worried about my job. And then what is the narrative that I tell? The narrative that I tell about the future as I perceive that it's going to be actually becomes the stress that I'm experiencing. Stress is not just something that comes to me, it just shows up at my door. Stress requires my cooperation in telling my story in a particular anxiety-provoking way. And as we said before, this does not mean, and we're not saying that stress, like somehow we shouldn't be stressed. If you had a fire that was coming in your house, like, would you be stressed? Yes, you would. And I think that your being stressed would be a good thing because you would probably act on that stress. The question is not, should we or should we not have stress? The question is, am I living in stress in that bell curve? Am I living in that, in the middle of that space where I'm actually able to regulate my stress, my anxiety response by not letting the narrative that I'm telling, the story element of my anxiety, get so far over on the bell curve that it paralyzes me, it overwhelms me, it keeps me from being able to act. And one of the most important things that helps us with that stress is making sure that we are connected with other people who can validate and say, Curt, this is really hard. This is hard. And now, what are some things that we can do? I might not be able to solve the whole problem, but what can I do? Which is exactly what we say to our children. What is the small thing that I can do? And here's the most amazing thing. If I take action, even small steps, to take action requires that my attention is focused in the present moment. And we may have heard me say this before. It is impossible for the body to be anxious and live in the present moment at the same time. Anxiety is primarily about future state. I'm feeling something about that which I'm anticipating that's coming in the future, whether it's 5 seconds or 5 minutes or years from now. If I'm in the present moment taking my next step, my brain is unable to be anxious in that moment. If I collect more moments like this, of I will do this, then I will do this, then I will do this, then I will do this, next thing I know, I'm on the bus. And I'm on the bus and traveling down the road and the things that I'm doing, and like I get to school. And I practice building resilience even in the face of having had anxiety. And so stress then becomes a thing that I don't worry about, but that I see it as something that I can use for possibility.
That's good. That's really good. We've got a lot of questions coming in. There's a couple here that I'm going to try to paraphrase that I feel are in the same kind of line. Just the idea of someone put in the question, like, compassionately force a child to make a decision or do something that is scary when they're not cooperating, when they're too scared to do it. Can you speak a little bit about in that parent role, not forcing, but there's just a little.
Right. This is, there's no question that we all know these moments where we find that children kind of put us in a position where we feel like, well, we actually, they won't put their shoes on but we have to go. And I'm anxious because I have to leave and they won't put their shoes on. And so, and hopefully they're not doing this like when they're 16, but I mean, you know what I mean? When they're little, we say, well, you can put your shoes on, or I'll put your shoes on for you. And they may, like, they might have a tantrum, say, well, I'll pick you up and take you to the car. And all these things, of course, it's easy for me to say these things here on Zoom, right? And as a parent of 30 and 27-year-old who, like, they're not doing that anymore. Mm-hmm. And I would say that it's in those moments where, one of the things that my wife, who's a child development specialist, likes to talk about, that there are times when it's negotiating. Like, I need you to put your shoes on, but what do you need? What do you need from me? What would you need? What would you like? And I know that you don't have an hour to negotiate these things, but we all find, and it can be any number of different ways in which we're sitting in this line between I've been compassionate, I've been empathic, they're still upset and they're still being uncooperative. And then there comes a point in time when we say, well, this is what we're going to do. And I want to say this, that what we do with children, even when we pick them up and we take them to put them in the car seat because they don't want to go in the car seat, but we put them in the car seat, that we do that is less the issue than how we do that. And it takes a lot of work for us to continue to have a calm voice while I'm putting my child in my car seat. And they're like, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I want to suggest that mostly what it's going to be important for you then, who's put your child in the car seat while they are like flailing around, it's going to be helpful for if you have, if your spouse is with you, it's going to be helpful that your spouse says to you at some point, that was really hard and I'm really proud of how well you did that. And that we also have people who are sharing with us, who are acknowledging to us in the same way that we are acknowledging to our children, this is really hard. I know you don't want to get in the car seat. I know you don't. This is really hard. And you're upset and I'm kind of upset, but we have to get in the car seat. And at some point, I'm going to have somebody come back to me and say, Curt, that was really hard for you to do. And I'm really proud of you doing it. I realize we'd all like to have an answer, for every single situation where that line, we don't know what to do. And I want to say, kids don't need parents who are perfect. Kids need parents who are transparent, who are willing to repair ruptures, and who can say that we're doing the best we can, and who can be honest about where we are. And as long as we are willing to repair ruptures, be mindful about those moments, even when we have to do things when they're not being cooperative, in the long run, we teach them that life is difficult. In this world, you will have tribulation. But do not, he doesn't even just don't be afraid. He said, be of good cheer. I'm like, for crying out loud, be of good cheer in a pandemic, be of good cheer in the middle of these racial tensions, be of good cheer in our, you gotta be kidding me. That's what he said. And I want to suggest that be of good cheer because I am doing things. It's not be of good cheer because of these facts about the landscape. It's a be of good cheer because you are not by yourself in this work that you're doing. I will not leave you alone as orphans. I will come for you. And so in this regard, we continually have to have people coming for us so that we can know that even in those moments where we've made a decision and we don't know if it's been perfect or imperfect, that we aren't being left alone either.
Wow. Well, I can't think of a better way to end our time today. Thank you, Dr. Curt Thompson. As always, you are such a great friend of the CAFO community, and we all learned so much from you. Thank you for being transparent, even as you talk. Every time I hear you, you're being transparent about something and modeling that for us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.